Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give it about a minute or so to allow everyone to come in, connect to their audio, and get situated before we get started. Okay, so while a few more attendees are virtually making their way in, I will go ahead and take care of a few housekeeping items. My name is Brittany Boston, and I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and I will be the facilitator and technical assistance side of today's webinar. So welcome to the Perkins Data Dashboard workshop. Just a few reminders. As an attendee on today's webinar, you are in listen-only mode, but there are several ways for you to interact with our presenters and ask questions. You do have the chat box down on your little toolbar. Just a reminder, if you want to chat in that to section, you have the option to pick all panelists, which would be myself, Natasha, Jay, and Sam. Or if you want to share with everyone that's participating, you can choose the all panelists and attendees options. You have the ability to raise your hand if you would like to be unmuted and ask a question. We can do it that way as well. And then there is the Q&A feature if you would rather not use the chat for whatever reason. This is also being recorded. And so if you have to step out or have colleagues that may be interested in this information, we will be sharing this out for you to watch back later next week. And I believe that is all of the housekeeping. And if you have any issues with audio or technical assistance, please feel free to reach out to me and send me a message in the chat, and I will do my best to support you as I can. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Natasha Allen.
Thanks so much, Brittany. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon for our Perkins Data Dashboard workshop. I will introduce myself, and then I'm going to have Jay and Sam also introduce themselves. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Natasha Allen, and I am the Senior Director for Career and Technical Education at the Community College Board.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jay Brooks. I'm the Senior Director for Research and Policy Studies at ICCB. And I'm really excited to have so many attendees on a Friday afternoon for a data session. So we're really eager to roll this thing out and begin to get feedback. So looking forward to today.
And I'm Sam Miller. I'm the Associate Director for Research and Policy Studies. And I'm as well very pleased to meet you all on a Friday afternoon.
So I'd also like to echo what Jay said. I'm excited to see so many people on this workshop, and this dashboard is something we've been wanting to do for several years now. So I hope that you enjoy it and find it useful. Our research and policy study folks, specifically Jay and Sam, have been working so hard to make it usable, to make it clean, to make it look nice, and to make it really work for you and your institution. So with that, we'll get started. So we already did introductions. I'm going to go ahead and do a brief overview of the Perkins application required data components. I know we just had the Perkins guidelines meeting in March, but I'm just going to quickly go over the two data components, just so we can remember the background before we get into talking about the data. And then Sam is going to do a few slides about really understanding the data before we get into looking at the dashboard. And then to wrap it up, Jay is going to give us an overview and a tutorial of the data dashboard itself. Okay, so what is required for Perkins data when you're submitting your Perkins application? So there are two data components, your performance data analysis and the performance improvement plan. And I think we all know this by now, but I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the performance data analysis and not so much talking about the performance improvement plan, just because we've talked about that a lot. However, the performance data analysis component is the new component for this year's application. All right, so what do you have to do for your performance data analysis? So Perkins 5 requires you to disaggregate data by student populations, special populations, each core indicator. And when we say core indicator, we're talking about 1P1, 2P1, and 3P1, according to CTE program, program of study, or career cluster. So the table that you'll be filling out is this handy little table right here. And this performance data analysis table is really the surface level. This is what's going to show you, okay, this is my actual level of performance, or ALP, and it's going to show you how you match up to the state's determined level of performance, or SDLP, for each one of those performance indicators. So again, that's 1P1, 2P1, and 3P1. So just a reminder, for this year, for your fiscal year 22 application, you'll be completing the fiscal year 2021 columns, okay? We can't look into the future and know what the data is going to be for FY22. I wish we could, especially, you know, during COVID and quote after COVID. But so you're going to be looking at your fiscal year 21 data. So as you're going through your data and you're trying to decide, okay, looking at my data and how am I meeting at my institution? Am I meeting, am I exceeding, or am I underperforming versus that state determined level of performance, or SDLP? So for 1P1, am I above or am I below that 69%? So again, this table is just going to tell you really surface level. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use the data dashboard tool that Jay's going to go over here in a few slides to look at that disaggregated data by your student populations, your special populations, and then also each CTE program, program of study, or career cluster. And what's great about the data dashboard is that it does that for you. You just need to know how to look at the data. So I hope no one's going to miss those seemingly hundreds of spreadsheets that we had to open. But those are the days of the past. So we're finally moving into the 21st century. Okay, so after you complete your data analysis table, question number 2 here is going to ask you just a couple of questions about getting more specific about your data. So did these gaps in performance that your data showed, do they correlate with any of those equity gaps that you uncovered when you did your CLNA process last year? We're also asking that you have a plan in place for, say, if over the next 3 years, these performance gaps persist, what's your plan to really take action and address those performance gaps? How are you going to try to make sure that you're still serving those students to the best of your ability and really figuring out and finding out why specific subpopulations are bringing some of your performance metrics down? And then finally, after you look at all your data, you're going to utilize your performance improvement plan, or PIP, to really detail those activities that are going to address those identified gaps. So again, you're going to use your PIP, and that's where you're going to put the specific activities that are going to go into your annual work plan. And like I said earlier, I'm not going to really go into the PIP that much, just because I think we've all heard about that enough probably. I want to make sure we really get into the meat of our presentation today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam.
Thank you, Natasha. So just a quick overview of how you can understand this data. 3P1, which is our non-traditional enrollment rate, is derived from the students class enrolled as a CTE concentrator and in a SIP that is classified as non-traditional based on their student's gender. To move on to 2P1, it is derived from the students enrolled as a CTE concentrator, and it shares the same denominator as 3P1, the total number of CTE concentrators. 1P1 is derived from the CTE concentrators earning a certificate or diploma in 2P1, but 1P1's denominator is the same as 2P1's numerator. And actually, I just got a question from Amy, if I missed it. Yes, you will get the slides, I believe, to this presentation. And all this data is derived from A1 annual student enrollment and completion data submission and the AC annual course data submission. Can we go to the next slide? Next slide, please.
Sorry, Sam, hold on, it's not letting me. There we go.
There we go. Now, this picture right here, there we are. Just wondering why we're looking at 2P1. I'm supposed to be looking at 3P1. This picture is in a handout from the Perkins 5 post-secondary measure inclusion flow chart. And so, I'm sorry, and it's mostly calculated using the primary enrollment SIP and completely enrollments calculated through the enrollment of, my apologies, through the A1 item 16. If that SIP is associated with the student's enrollment prefix and the number is non-traditional based on the student's gender, it will be counted in the numerator. And if we go to the next slide.
Sam, if I could, let me add just a little bit into what you said there, because, and I see a few questions that are coming in on chat, and a couple of things I will touch on when we get to the actual dashboard. And I want to say the good thing is we have, a couple of hours today, and hopefully, we'll be able to give you back a little bit of your time. But the nice thing is we actually have a little bit of time to talk through some of this stuff. And I know as you guys really, whether you're an IR or you're working directly in Perkins, this stuff gets really nuanced pretty quickly, right? There's a lot of sort of like little details here and there. And for some of you, you're not familiar with our A1 submission that the colleges make on your behalf, or the AC submission. That's okay. We're going to talk a little bit about that and about some sort of resources that are available to help facilitate conversation between Perkins folks and IR folks. And one of the things too that we will touch on a little bit is one of the things that we've encountered as we sort of looked at Perkins data and looked at some of the baseline analysis is oftentimes we have this situation where individuals are enrolled in CTE, they're getting CTE awards. And to Sam's point about that primary declared major, if you think of it as a, like the A1 item around the declared major, sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect between what the student shows up on the student's file as a declared major and what they actually end up earning. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. But to help account for that, one of the things that we did is we also looked at specific behavior. We looked at course taking behavior, and we actually looked at the degrees that were awarded to the student. And so by doing that, that helps us to address that issue. If someone came in and they had maybe a declared major that was a transfer degree, but all of their activity, all of their course activity says, well, really, this person should be counted as a CTE or counted in Perkins. We did some things to help us account for that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do want to just sort of add that little caveat, because this gets very nuanced quickly, is yes, as Sam said, we're looking at that primary enrollment to see if the person's in CTE, but we also took and looked additionally at their behavior. And for those of you who've been in Perkins for a while, you can probably recall in Perkins 4, we looked at things like student intent and their degree objective. And we tried to get away from that because, like the issue of a declared major, sometimes student intent changes, right? And so by actually looking at actual real behavior based on the files from your colleges, that helps us to address that issue. And we can definitively point to it and say, okay, maybe the student planned on doing this when they enrolled, but actually over the course of the academic year, here's what really happened. So I just want to add that as a little bit of a caveat to provide a little bit of the nuance here to some of this stuff that can get fairly complicated fairly quickly. So Sam, go ahead.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for that explanation. if we can continue on to 2P1. Now, 2P1, it's the same denominator as 3P1. That is the only way they are linked. Once we get to 2P1, it's this process. It is then 2P1 success is determined by the checking for a completion in the A1, specifically items 39, 42, or 45. These items do collect the degree code of the student's first 3 completions. And that's nothing that you have to worry. That's a lot of on a back end side. Okay. These items collect the degree code. Additionally, the completion type variable A1 item 35 must also be associated with code 1 graduate completer. If there is any, those are tick yes, they are counted in our numerator, and then we get the rate for credential attainment by dividing that over the total number of CTE concentrators. And we go down to 1P1. And we take that same number of degree completions, and that is now our denominator. 1P1 success is determined by checking for subsequent employment, and we do that with a data match from IDES, Illinois Department of Employment Security, and subsequent post-secondary enrollment with the National Student Clearinghouse in second quarter post-completion. Now, please note, for measures 2P1 and 1P1, this is a 2-year lagging match with the student cohort first seen in 3P1. So again, like Natasha said, we love to be able to look forward into the future, but we have to wait for this 2P1 or the 2-year gap to get all the data, and we can actually get an accurate picture. I see we do have some chat questions. What about completer code 6 reverse transfer? That's a good question. Jay?
Yeah, I will address those in just a moment. I'm keeping track of the chats that are coming in, and I'll address them all at the same time, Sam. So go ahead and finish up with what you have.
I believe that, oh, we have one more slide. And this is an overview of all the special populations that we have to keep track of now. I think the newest ones are youth who are in or have aged out of the foster care system, youth with parent in armed forces and on active duty, and which is the last one, I believe it
Homeless
is
individuals.
Homeless individuals, thank you. And those we just started collecting in fiscal 19, as you can see in the description. We currently do not have too much data on that in our system, but we will be needing that information from you all shortly, so we can actually start getting the numbers as we need. And,
yeah, so I think, Sam, that's the end of the slides, I believe, right?
believe so.
So let's go ahead before I jump in here, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And okay, so a few questions have come in to the chat. And one thing in terms of just sort of wrapping up with what Sam was sharing there, for those of you who are in Perkins, just rest assured that your IR staff, your IR colleagues at your community colleges, they have been providing us the data for these new subgroups for Perkins. They started, as Sam said, in FY19. Typically what we see is when we introduce a new variable like these 3 that Sam alluded to, the first year the collection will be somewhat spotty, and then in the next year it gets a little bit better. Some of these particular subgroups are very difficult to collect and to collect accurately, for example, in some of our past IR meetings. folks have expressed the concern that it's really difficult to capture, for example, information about homeless students and things of that nature. So we are aware of that. We ask that, as colleges look at collecting this item, if there's things that can be done to sort of refine your processes and better collect that variable, whether it's a new one or one that's existed for a while. We always encourage you to do that so that you have a holistic picture of what's happening. So a couple of questions that have come in are related to summer graduates. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I actually get into the dashboard, but we are, in part, we are looking at graduates across a 2-year period from the cohort year. And I think it will make a little bit more sense as you see it in the dashboard. But what we want to do is, in as much as we possibly can, because remember, none of this is stuff that we are just pulling out of the ether, right? This is all coming from what you guys give to us, and then we pull it together to run these outcomes. But we are looking specifically to see if an individual who was in your 3P1 cohort, whether they were non-traditional or not, we're looking to see if they completed, if they earned a credential or an award, and then later on, after the time period has elapsed, we would check with things like IDS and the National Student Clearinghouse to look at the placement rate of 1P1. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. I believe there was also a question that came through in chat. Brittany, I'm having a little trouble seeing the chat pop up right now. Let's see here. Okay, I've got it back now. So the question was, what about completer code 6 reverse transfer? This is similar to the degree code. Well, this reverse transfer is different. So there's 2 different codes that we have added recently to our collection. One is around reverse transfer, and another is around what we call the GEC, or General Education Certificate. Both of those are brought into the equation and would be considered as an award for the student. These are not Perkins specific awards, but they are counted as either a credential or a completion. So those would be factored in when we reach the point where we are matching against that time period. So really, both of those classify as a completion type 1, a graduate completer. Both of those awards, both the reverse transfer and that GECC award, both of those are considered to be graduate completions. We do the same thing for iPads. And for those maybe not real familiar with iPads, it's something that we do on behalf of the community colleges, where we report a whole series of different data points around graduation rate and outcome measures and things of that nature related to colleges and the students that you serve. So the question about the impact of the 2-year gap on data, you will see that quite clearly as we look at the dashboard in just a moment. So I'll circle back to that one. But it does, in terms of how readily available the data is, there is an issue with that. Part of our limitation there, and I'll probably touch on this a couple of times, is just the fact that when wage records become available from the Department of Employment Security, they have their own processes of collecting data, and this is not there's not a data source sitting out there where we can just immediately tap into wage earnings. So there is a bit of a delay, especially once a person is completed, and we have to wait 2 quarters to check on to see whether or not they were employed. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we look at the dashboard and we specifically get into 1P1. And the disadvantaged is economically disadvantaged. To that question, yes, that is correct. So let's now flip over. And what I'm going to do is, there's a lot of information today that I'm going to be sharing with you guys. Let me preface this whole thing by saying this: we're considering this a beta release. And by beta release, I mean this is a work in progress. We hope that this will make your life easier, but we know that this is not a finished product. And part of what we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks and ongoing is asking for feedback from you guys, telling us, here's what works, here's what doesn't work, here's what we'd like to see, here's maybe some additional ways that we would like to see the data. Not that this is a guarantee, I want to be clear, this is not a guarantee that we can provide you with every single thing that you want, but what we want to do is create a tool that is as useful as we can possibly make it and allow you to be able to evaluate the outcomes of your programs. So certainly, always be looking for that opportunity to provide feedback, and don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Sam or Tasha and let us know. This one nice thing about what we're doing right now and in terms of this rollout is I know Perkins plans are due May 14th, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Tasha. I think that's correct. But I'm a big believer that in order for data to have meaning, you have to be able to use it in a real world context. So what's nice about right now, since you guys are wrapping up your Perkins plans, you'll be using this. And that's a great time to give us the feedback, because you can say this helped or this didn't. And there's a couple of things that I'm not going to be showing this today, but we already know that we want to improve as sort of the second release. But keep in mind that what we're showing you today is the beta release to get you going and to be able to take what historically was a lot of complicated work. For those who attended the PODS trainings historically, we would often have spreadsheets, and you would go and you would pull different spreadsheets from our original POD site, which is what you are seeing right now. This is the original Perkins online data system that we use for Perkins 4. And as you can see here, had a landing page, but for each measure under Perkins 4, the way this information was conveyed is each year was isolated to its own year, and you had all of your subgroups. But if you wanted to look at multiple years, you would have to go and pull multiple files and then take the data from those files and plug it into the spreadsheet that you were using to do your analysis or something like that. So as we kind of re-envision this, and to Tasha's point earlier, this is something that we've been wanting to do for a while. And so we thought, what would be a great way to be able to convey the same kind of information that you saw in PODS, the original PODS, but to do it in a more visually pleasing way where you don't have, 8, 10, 12, 15 spreadsheets, but instead can look at one measure at one time, over time on a dashboard. So that's what we wanted to accomplish. Now, I know I see some names here of some of my IR colleagues from different colleges, and I know some of you guys have been using Power BI for a while. So as we kind of looked at the landscape of different dashboards that were available, there's a lot of them out there, we decided to go with Power BI. And so Power BI is a new tool for ICCB, and it's something that we are looking at how we can move data into that platform. And Perkins is one of the first things that we've taken on to migrate that data to a platform, a dashboard platform. And I think, as I said, you'll find that it's much more of a graphic representation as opposed to all these spreadsheets. So this was the original Perkins site. What we have done now is we've basically just created a new site, and you'll see it's called PODS 2. And basically, this is where you will access Perkins. And Sam, if you wouldn't mind in the chat, maybe go ahead and plug in the this URL along with the login and password. We would be sending this out as well, but just in case you guys wanted to look at it, some of you are running multiple screens and might want to look at it as we go along. That's perfectly fine. But in the original POD system, you could access it. There was no login password. You could just go in and pull any spreadsheet that you wanted. Especially right now, in light of it being in a beta format and things like that, we wanted to put a password on this so that in order to actually access the dashboards, you have to have a login and password, and we'll provide you guys with that. So this is our Perkins PODS 2.0 website. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is part of what Sam was sharing with you guys was this flow chart. And I know this is a part of the Perkins plan. I know this information was shared and is publicly available. We have, as we've received feedback, we have kind of went in and done some modifications to this document. I'm going to bring this up and bring up my actual PDF here. Because there were some places, not that it was wrong, but just that it wasn't clear. So, sometimes you create a flow chart or you create a resource document and you think it's clear, but when folks start using it, they're like, well, that's kind of confusing. So we wanted to clarify that. So there is a new version, and that's available directly on the website, and you can access it directly through this link. So let's take a look just before we get deep into the weeds here. I do want to point out this whole issue of lagging data. So in October of 2020, we reported, because right now, as of right now, where things stand right now, the most recent data that we have from your college, from your A1 and your AC submission, is what happened in fiscal year 20, okay? So what's taking place in fiscal year 21, that information doesn't come to us until the end of the fiscal year, and we have a whole process of when we collect that. But that process would begin, and we would begin to make that available around October of 2021 for 3P1 specifically, right? Because what we're doing here is we're taking your most recent data set, and we are seeing if the individuals in the specific SIP that they are enrolled in, that program of study, whether or not it's a non-traditional SIP for that particular gender. And if so, that's how we're calculating the non-traditional rate. But 3P1 is a real-time metric. We don't have to have multiple years, or we don't have to wait for any other agency in order to match things. We can just literally pull the most recent data set we have from your college and say, here's the, statewide, for example, here was the 35,000 students who were in a who met the definition for Perkins, and then we can determine whether or not they had a non-traditional SIP. And the one thing I want to point out here, as you look at this flow chart, I know some of you have seen it before, some of you may be new, and if I'm saying some things today or maybe repeating some things today that you've already heard, my apologies, but I don't want to make assumptions about who all is on the call. And given that we have almost 100 participants today, I'm assuming there's probably some folks out there who are new in their role and they're just trying to get their heads around all of this. So this whole flow chart, though, is designed to say, from the point of a person entering the college to the point of them going into Perkins and into the follow-up measures, how does that happen? So you can see here, just checking for eligibility, this very first method that we use, this is getting to that whole issue of trying to address a disconnect between declared majors and actual activity. So if an individual doesn't have a declared major in Perkins, but they had in the academic year, let's say they had 15 hours of CTE programming according to your course submission, and maybe they even ended up with a Perkins award. If we just looked at their declared major, if that was a declared major, we'd miss that person. We wouldn't even be able to report that success because we're not looking at CTE programs completed. So that's why in this definition, in this method, you're seeing both the declared major or that they were in had a completion in a CTE program of study. Now, both of those have to be coupled with, they had to have earned 12 credit hours in the academic year, not enrolled, but actually earned. And then the other part to keep in mind is, for those of you who are in IR, we've got degree codes like 18, 30, 35, 40. For those of you in Perkins, it's like, okay, but that doesn't mean anything to me. All that is telling us, all those degree codes mean are that these are degree codes that are less than 1 year in duration. And many times we have folks who are coming in earning CTE awards. Maybe they don't get 12 hours in the academic year because the specific CTE certificate that they earned was actually less than 12 credit hours. So if that happens, the Perkins 5 legislation allows us to still pull that individual in, and we're pulling that from things like the 18, 30, 35, 40 degree codes, so short-term certificates. So I won't go over into great detail any of this stuff. Sam already kind of touched on this, but this flow chart basically lets you know whether or not a person's in Perkins, and then it just moves you through the process. Because if you think of it from the standpoint of 3P1 is what we'll be looking at first, and then the reason we're giving 2 years here. So let's take a second to think about this. So let's say, for example, for FY20, those folks that we have the most recent data on is FY20. That's what was used to determine the 3P1 number for what you're going to see in the dashboard. In order to follow up and give those individuals enough time to have earned an award, especially those who might be in an AAS program, for example, Associate in Applied Science, we have to give them a couple of years. So like if we're looking at 20 individuals, we would look at fiscal year 20 and we'd look at fiscal year 21. Maybe they completed their program in 20, maybe they didn't complete it until academic year 21. And the reason we have that lag is that way we can say, okay, the individual who was in this FY20 cohort, right, of 3P1 students, over the course of 20 and 21, here's what happened to that individual. And sometimes you have, I know many of you have programs where you have stackable certificates, right? And you may have somebody who earns a short-term certificate, maybe they earn a long-term certificate, and then the next year they earn their associate. If that occurs, the way that we have this set up, we would actually be able to look at both years and say, okay, what was the most recent award that they received in that 2-year period? And that way we can place them in the category that reflects that, okay? So that's kind of why we see this lag. Now, something that's for a conversation of another day. You know, the issue of when data becomes available, we have a lot more flexibility with both fiscal, with 3P1 and 2P1, because all of that is information coming from you guys that we package and come up with the rates. It's only 1P1 where we really have this restriction on when data is available. And that's why we sort of coupled 2P1 with 1P1. And all we're saying in 2P1 is, of the folks who were in that 20 cohort, like right here, at this time, which is looking at 20 and 21, here's how many earned that award. And then we take that group and say, okay, based on the academic year of their last completion, 2 quarters later, how many of them are either employed based on UI wage records, and that does require an SSN for matching, or if not employed, showing up in a subsequent post-secondary activity through that match with the National Student Clearinghouse. That's how we can determine that success rate. So this, and not that I want to spend a lot of time on this today, I can certainly answer any questions that come up about it, but I do want to point, this flow chart is helpful. But one thing I also find helpful is the second couple of pages in this document. For those of you who are in Perkins, you know, you may see this group of measures here and go, okay, A1 item, I don't know what any of that is, right? But the reason that we've provided this to you is we know you work closely with your IR staff, and I know IR staff, you know, like all of us, they have a full plate. There's a lot that are asked of them, and they're pulling data for usually multiple divisions all the time. But our hope is that if you can talk to your IR folks and say, for example, let's say that you're looking at your data and you say, you know what, it looks like we don't have any English language learners, for example. And I know that we have, what's going on there? You can say, you know, what are we showing in A1 item 23? And then your IR folks will be able to go and actually pull that data for that year, and that would tell them exactly why you maybe don't have any in that group, because we can only report and we can only convey what you are giving to us. You know, we make no assumptions about anything. It has to be right there in the data set. So our hope, though, is that by having this sort of cheat sheet, this will help you to sort of direct IR to what it is that you want to look at. The final thing I want to point out, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it unless there's questions, but for each measure here, we're telling you both how we calculate the numerator and the denominator. So all the stuff that Sam was sharing in terms of how 3P1's denominator gets pulled and then how the numerator is calculated, it's all right here. One of the things that we did here that I think is helpful is it lets you sort of see the timeline. So for example, for 3P1, you can see when we begin the match and when we end the match. So for example, the date that data for 3P1 was publicly available for fiscal year 20 data was roughly around October 2020. It's part of that has to do with when colleges finalize their data and all that kind of stuff, but typically around October, November, something like that is when we can make that publicly available. It kind of aligns with when our fall collection for IPEDS closes. But what that lets you know is for October 2020, you're looking at every student served in this time range, right? And we're only checking 1 year. But where this really gets, and 3P1 is pretty clear. You know, I said a lot of times we get into the weeds into this stuff so deep, it's really easy to kind of lose your mind and go, wait a minute, what am I tracking here? What's going on? Where that really becomes an issue is with 2P1 and with 1P1. So let's take 2P1 because that's the first group we're going to be following, right? We're taking that group of individuals who met the definition for Perkins, and we'd look to see if they're non-traditional. And then we're going to step over and using FY20 as an example again, the cohort that we're pulling from would be the FY18's 3P1 group, because we're going to look between July 1 of 2017 and 6/30 of 2019. So we're looking at both fiscal year 18 and fiscal year 19. And we're looking to see if they had a completion in either one of those fiscal years. And if they did, and they were successful, then they get dropped into 1P1. And down here, you can see it lets you know when the data is available through IDS for the wage matching. This column right here is really the one that's important. This really drives a lot of the reason for the delay and some of the stuff not being as timely as you would like it, or probably as we would like it. But for example, you know, when we look at FY18 data, which is going to be what we show you today in terms of 2P1 and 1P1, we weren't able to actually match the results of your completers from that group until June of 20, because if you think about it, let's say they completed at the end of fiscal year 19, right? So because they're in the 18 cohort, they completed around the end of 19. That means we got to check 2 quarters later, which would be, if you think about it here, we would come over and say, okay, if you were in 19, we're going to check in the 4th quarter of 2019. That's when we have to look to see if you're employed, right? But that quarter, 2019 Q4, which is November to December of 2019, IDS doesn't have that ready to match. It's not in from their employers until June of 20. So there's always about a 2-quarter, 3-quarter lag on when data is available, okay? So all of this information in this cheat sheet hopefully would be a good reference point as you look at this information and you see maybe things that you think doesn't reflect your college. You know, that's something that we often get. I know Tasha's team has heard that as well. And the key takeaway for this part is make sure that it does. You know, if it's not, then let's work together and make sure that, you know, if something's not being fed to us, you know, what kinds of processes can we put in place to help make sure that you have better coverage around a specific element. So I just wanted to take a few minutes and walk through that, and then we're going to flip back over to PODS 2.0. Now, before I move into the dashboard, the primary reason why we're here today, let me stop and open things up for questions. I just saw that there's a few things that come through in chat. Is there any questions that we need to, anyone has that we need to take in right now? Any other questions?
Nope, I think we got them all covered, Jay.
Okay, all right, good deal. All right, so let's go ahead then and jump into the dashboard. So as you visit the 2.0 site, you'll see here the dashboard. Some of you are already there. When you click on this link for the this beta version, you'll see that we have a landing page designed right now, fairly elemental, but it outlines all the specific measures and lets you know that you're in the beta release version. And what we have here is all 3 measures are outlined, right? So let's go first to 3P1 and take a look at that measure. Now, for those of you who have worked in dashboards for a while, you can probably relate to our pain here. One of the things that's always difficult with dashboards is how much data do we give? How many different slides, how many different places do we want them to go? Versus there's always this kind of struggle with making it user-friendly versus giving too much data, all that kind of stuff. So what we sort of tried to do here is sort of frame this around the subgroups and also some high-level stuff. So let's just take a few minutes and kind of walk through what's happening here. And again, what I really want to encourage you guys to do, I believe, Tasha, what we have planned is sometime in the next couple of weeks or so, a really brief survey that would be sending out to you guys to ask for feedback on this. But I really also want to encourage you, since you're going to be doing your Perkins plans over the next 2 weeks, if something comes up, don't hesitate to just send us an email. You know, maybe it's something that we can even adjust on the fly and push. You know, that's one of the nice things about this is we don't have to start from scratch. We can really kind of make an adjustment and push that out, and it's in the public or in the dashboard for you to use. So don't hesitate to reach out to us if you find something that would be helpful or useful that you're not seeing. So for each measure, what you're going to find is this header row, and what we see here is a way to kind of get oriented. In the upper left corner of your row, you're going to see what the screen's displaying in terms of which measure you're looking at. Just a little identifier here to let you know that you're in 2.0. And we have some filters here. Now, first we've got college name and we've got career cluster. And these 3 right here, you can see from the data below, before I get too deep into that, you can see that we're displaying multiple fiscal years. Now, if you think about the original system, remember when we were looking at any measure, instead of having it all at one time, each year was its own spreadsheet. So in order to see what we're talking about here, you would have had to go to, for one measure, 4 different spreadsheets. And if you think about 8 to 10 measures, including your subgroups, you're starting to get up into 30, 40 different spreadsheets, right? So what we have here is we have all 4 years displayed. Now, initially when you look at this, you know, we sort of toyed with, should we display percentages? Was that going to be confusing? Do we want to give raw numbers? And so we tried to settle on a place where we give you both. And I'm going to kind of show you how you get to that information. And also with these 3 at the top, foster care, homeless, and parent active duty, keep in mind, we know that, and you'll see even in the drop downs that are available here, there's a not applicable, because if you're looking at data from fiscal year 17 or 18, that wasn't collected at that point. And then for 19, it's really, really spotty. And that's why we don't have any individual boxes to look at, because, folks, it's a new variable. They're just collecting it for the first time. And that's the case for all three of these. Now here, what we have is we have a college name, and this has been set up so that instead of selecting just one, typically, which is what most colleges want to do, but let's say you're maybe, like Illinois Eastern or the City Colleges of Chicago, something like that, you actually can come in and by holding down the control key on this, you can actually select, multiple colleges at one time, right? Now, typically that's not going to be the case. What you might want to do there, for most programs is they're just going to want to see maybe their college. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight College of DuPage, and I'm going to close this. Now, you'll notice that when I did that, all of my filters down here are adjusting, right? So what we've just told, for those who are not familiar with Power BI, we've just said, let's just look at just College of DuPage. And that's the group we want to filter to. And at any point, if I want to get rid of a filter, I can just click my little eraser here and clear out the selections, and it'll take me back to what I was looking at. And so really, let's take a moment then and see kind of what the visuals below are telling us. So again, upon initial glance, it looks like it's really busy. But especially if you're a Perkins person or you work in Perkins and you know the variables, it will start to make sense pretty quickly. So what we have here on the second row is we've got links to returning to the home page, which is just the landing page, right? And then we've got links to the other measures, whether it be 2P1 or we can also go to 1P1 and look at that measure. So we're going to go ahead and go back to 3P1 where we started. So these are just hyperlinks to let you navigate around and jump around and look at different measures, everything self-contained within its own screen. And what we've included up here is just because all of these other years, 17 through 20, for all practical purposes, it was kind of baseline collection, right? There were some things that we had to report federally, but most of that information was sort of, high level, like participant and concentrator information. It wasn't so much performance, as it was just like, okay, here's some Perkins totals around participation and concentrators. But this tells you for the most recent year, or for the year which we have our first target established, here's what that is. Now, the reason we want to include that is, even though technically speaking, we're getting ready to move into FY21's reporting cycle, and that's what, in terms of 3P1, but that lets you know for the first measure where non-trad rate has a target, if you're looking at your college, it will let you know, here's how my college is doing in terms of non-traditional participation compared against that target. And then finally, over here on the far right, anytime that you apply filters to this data set, it's going to automatically filter down to show you the total number of students for fiscal year 20 and the total non-trad enrollment for fiscal year 20. Now, all these other charts are showing you multiple fiscal years, right? But what we wanted to do here was just have a quick, sometimes numbers are not just percentages, but numbers is something you want to know. And so just primarily because of a real estate issue, what we want to do is to show you, so, okay, for the most recent year, here's what these two numbers look like. So statewide, in fiscal year 20, we had 36,893 students who met the definition for Perkins 5 and was reported in 3P1. Of those individuals, 4,291 were in a non-traditional program. So we know that right off the bat. And going back earlier to what, like I did with College of DuPage, when I do that, the number is going to adjust to show me just College of DuPage's numbers for that year, right? So I'm going to go ahead and clear that out. I think most of these are visuals. I said this earlier. I think most of these visuals are fairly self-explanatory, but there is one that I will admit that we sort of struggled with. How can we do this in a way that will make sense? I'm not sure that we arrived exactly where we'd hoped to, but hopefully with a little bit of explanation, it will make more sense. And that is this very first box. So what you see here is the non-trad participation rate by fiscal year for selected items and for state, okay? So let me tell you in plain English what that means. What you see with the blue line is for the items you selected, here's what your non-traditional participation rate was for the year in question. The red will always represent the state and then the items you selected. So right now I have no filters, right? So that's why all of the rates match, they're all the same, because I don't have anything selected and the state rate is the same because there's nothing selected here. But if we go back to College of DuPage, not that I'm picking on College of DuPage, but we're just using their larger program. Now you can see we're starting to get some separation, right? The state rate didn't change. The state rate is still the same. So our next target for 3P1 is 9.6%. And you can see we're actually already a bit above that. Now, fiscal year 20, I would be remiss here if I didn't include this little caveat for you guys. I know many of you have been working off of the non-traditional SIP list. We did receive, and it was sort of late in coming, but we did receive a updated SIP list for non-traditional participation. And we have made that available to Perkins folks, but the rate doesn't, the calculation doesn't change. It's just some SIPs that maybe before weren't considered non-traditional are. You don't have to know what all of those were when you're looking at this visual. It's just doing the same thing and saying if this SIP in that year was non-traditional for that gender, then you count it as a success in your non-traditional rate. But you can see here, I'm looking at this percentages, and I can see for this program in the state, here's what it looks like, and here's what the target was. Now, the reason we wanted to give you this, not only does it let you see how your program, the blue, is doing against that target for FY21, but it also lets you see how your program is doing against how the state is doing overall, right? So if I'm at College of DuPage, I might say, okay, statewide in FY20, about 11.6% of the students had a non-traditional program of study, a non-traditional participation statewide. But I'm at 12.9%, so that means more of my students are participating in non-traditional programs than what the state average is. Now, one thing that's nice about this too is, let's say, for example, I go up and I apply the career cluster. So I'm going to use this filter, and I'm going to use health science. I'm going to add that in as a filter. Now, something unique has happened here. So this box, again, it's taking the selected items and giving you a rate in blue. And here, the selected items include College of DuPage and health science. And it tells you what that rate is for that program. Now, you noticed here the state rate changed, right? It was 11.6, and now it's at 9.3%, because the state rate, the red line, doesn't care about the program. It's always going to be looking at state, right? But it does take your other filters into consideration. So this is saying, if I'm at College of DuPage, using my previous example, I would say, okay, so, overall, if I remove the cluster, I was performing, I had a higher non-traditional participation rate than the state. But when I look specifically at my health science cluster, I'm slightly below how the rest of the state is doing with that specific cluster, right? So the takeaway here, this is really the only box I had to spend this much time explaining, but what we were trying to get at is take your program and add any kind of filters you want and see what the non-traditional participation rate was, and then know that the red line is taking those same filters, excluding program, and giving you what that looked like for the state, okay? So I'm going to go ahead, and one thing I want to highlight here, just because I showed you there's these little individual clear selections that you see, but it may be that sometime you've been looking at things and you've got a bunch of different things you clicked on. If you ever reach a point you don't want to have to come back up here and just manually clear out everything, you see over in this upper left corner, there's a little button that says click to clear all filters. So whether I've got 2 filters or 10 filters, if I click this, everything's going to clear out and it's going to reset me back to a clean slate. So I'm back to, for 3P1, I'm back to the state totals. So the rest of these I'll kind of move over fairly quickly, and then we'll stop after 3P1 is, after we finish this part, and we will stop for questions. But what we did here with this next slide, as you can see, this is, the program and the selected items against the state and the selected items. This is our gender, this is race, and then down below here, you'll notice that we've taken the subgroups or the special populations and given them their own rates, right? So I can see those who were reported as disabled versus those who were not reported as disabled. I can see what that non-traditional rate looks like. I can see the same thing for economically disadvantaged, English language learners, single parents, out of the workforce. Alphabetical order, all of it's right there, 4 years worth of rates, right? Now on this gender one, let's go back up to this for just a second. Here, what we see is we can see for the program, we're seeing female and male, and imposed upon that is what the state rate is. So like if you go over here, this red line for the state, you're seeing this superimposed across your genders. So I can say, for example, in 12.3% statewide of females were in a non-traditional program, and 10.8% were in males were in a non-traditional program. The other thing that's nice about this too is sometimes when you're looking at this and you go, I know programs are often asked to come up with strategies around improvement. And, from the days when we did the old PODS training, folks would often say things like, well, I don't want to spend a lot of, that rate's low, but it only impacts 7 students. And I've got this other issue over here that's going to impact 50 students. So I'm going to direct my funds and my resources to that. Anytime that you're looking at these numbers, if you hover, you'll see these little things popping up. And that's telling you for that year, for example, if I look, I'm going to go back to 20 over here. For that year, fiscal year 20, I have 12.3% or female of the 20,020 students that were female, 2,464 or 12.31% had a non-traditional program. And all of these are set up to do that. So, you don't have to drill in or open up spreadsheets. You can just point at it and it'll tell you what the actual numbers are that are driving that. And this is true for all of these. So at any time you want to know, where's that percentage coming from? Is that based off of, to use my earlier example, is that based off of 50 students or 7 students? You just point at the thing you want to look at and it will tell you, for example, that, let's take single parent. So this will tell us, if you look at that in FY20, out of the total students there, we can see how many were non-traditional, were single parent, and how many of those had a non-traditional enrollment. So let's see here. And you can see, so out of the 36,893 total students, give you a little better context, I kind of stumbled over my words there. Out of 36,893 students in FY20, if I look at single parent, about 2,500 of those students are single parent, and 338 of them were in a non-traditional program. And the remaining group were not reported as single parent, over 34,000. That's statewide. So that's what this 20 is doing. The numbers that you see in your 20 on any of these measures that we're looking at, and those numbers pop up, these numbers, these 20 numbers will always add up to what you're seeing up here in this upper corner, okay? So one other thing, as you interact with dashboards, and there's a lot of different ways that we can do this, one thing that we sort of struggle with, I'll be honest here, is how do we set up the drilling, right? I mean, in terms of that is how do we set it up so that you can interact with the visualization and get to what you want to look at. And sometimes with these visualizations, if you click on a single year and just click on that particular chart, not point at it, not hover, but just click on it, you kind of get some weird results, because then what you're saying is I want to look at just that race, for example, in just that year. And then all of your other filters are going to respond to that. What we encourage programs to do, and this is kind of outlined in the on the landing page for PODS 2.0, is if you want to look at a certain group, like maybe you want to look at just African American students, instead of coming in and specifying the year, because all the years are already outlined for you, just go up into your legend. You can see every one of these items have a legend, and I can come over here and I can select African American. And when I do, it's going to highlight everything, and I'm going to see just African American students across the board. And I can pair this. Maybe I want to look at African Americans and I want to look at females who are African American. If I hold my control key and I come over and I click that part of the legend, all of the dashboard is going to respond to just that group, right? So that way it allows me to look at that group over time and see how they fared. And again, I can always clear things out with that little clear all in the upper right corner. And the reason I wanted to demonstrate that was if I come over and I said, let's say I want to look at African American in, let's say in 20. If I click on just that particular column, you can see it's doing exactly what I told it to, right? It's filtering to just 20. But, typically, at least in data analysis, oftentimes we want to see things over time and not just in a single year. And so therefore, that's why I encourage you as you're using it to actually come up and say, you know what, I do want to look at African Americans, and I want to see how their rates look over time. So this, again, is doing that same thing without isolating a year, okay? The other thing I want to show you before I stop for questions is, as you're looking at these measures, and let's say, you have decided you want to look at the economically disadvantaged, for example, and you've isolated it to your program. So I'm going to say, let's go with Elgin this time. So let's pick on someone else, right? So if I want to look at economically disadvantaged and I'm just looking at Elgin, I can come down here to this visualization, right click on it, and it will say show as a table, right? So that way I can still, and keep in mind, everything I'm saying, they all work in conjunction, right? I can still point at these, even though they're filtered, and get those numbers that we were talking about before. But also, if I right click and say show as a table, it's going to show me the charts, but it's also going to show me those underlying numbers. So here, what I'm seeing is, for those who are classified as economically disadvantaged, here's what their rates look like. Here's how many total students by year are being used to calculate that, and here's how many were non-traditional. And then it moves over and says, okay, those who were not classified as economically disadvantaged, here's what their rates look like, and here's what those numbers look like. And again, remember that 20 row, whether you're in this, whether you're up here, no matter where you're at, these numbers for 20 should always track back to what you see up here. That's always, should always be true. So what we have here, we have all of the career clusters outlined, and we've taken the SIPs, whether they be a SIP from the old system prior to fiscal year 20, or the new SIP 2020 that was released by federal officials. We are doing that crosswalk for you to put them in a specific career cluster. So let me clear this out. I see a few questions that have come in, and also, so I want to take a few moments and address these. So in terms of the first question here was, would we estimate numbers for fiscal year 21 for 3P1? So my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, is for FY21, what you're wanting to plug in there is the most recent number that we have available for 3P1, which would be your FY20 outcomes. Or
That's correct,
is that
Jay.
correct? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, so that answers that question. And then remember, your colleges will be submitting your FY21 data after the academic year ends. And then as we are preparing your 3P1 measure for FY21, we always work with the colleges to finalize data, make sure that data is accurate. We have a great team here at ICCB that works closely with your colleges and goes back and forth with them to make sure things are accurate. Then once we get to that point, we've finalized it, we'll produce the FY21 3P1 and make it available here. So just to be clear, could you tell us what percentage of College of DuPage would put on their PDA for 3P1? So if we go back to College of DuPage, I think this is similar to what we just answered there, but it's always good to have an example, right? So for College of DuPage, what you would be putting in for 3P1 would be 12.9%. Does that make sense? Hopefully, because you're going to the most recent data you have available. And the next question is, can I copy individual graphs? So one of the things that we are, I mentioned as I begin this conversation or discussion here, that one of the things we already have is sort of a list of kind of enhancements that we expect to be rolling out. One of those will center on, if you're showing data, no matter which table it is. Let's see here. Is the ability to export this data. So right now, it looks like it's loading here. Right now, what you're going to see, and here's those numbers. The export button is missing up here in the upper right corner, but we're going to fix this so that you can, one, export the underlying data into Excel, but then secondly, we're looking at some ways in which you can export the actual visual or the charts into either a PDF or possibly a PowerPoint. That's something we're sort of experimenting. I would ask you guys, and we want to give you guys good tools and we want to make them user friendly. This is sort of something where, fortunately, Sam has been really great, but this is something that, as I said, Power BI is new to ICCB, and we're working really hard to get up to speed on it. But we didn't want to become experts before we started to give you guys accurate, actionable information that you could use. And, so there's been a bit of a learning curve as with any new technology. I think we've made a lot of progress. And as I said, that's part of the beta release. We'll continue to refine things and make them better and make them more responsive to your needs. So just looking at any other questions. So question coming in regarding the IR, what we can do. This is a question about looks like several questions have come in here. So I'm just sort of looking through the list here. So the total students and the total non-trad enrollments don't change from the selected items and the state non-traditional. So I'm not sure if I'm following. Total students and don't change from the selected items. So these numbers change based on any filter that is applied. And this rate over here that you're seeing, this is always going to represent the state rate. Hopefully I'm understanding your question, but if you need to unmute yourself, just let us know and we can look at that a little, or discuss a little further. So, and you selected your college right underneath here. That's correct. One question is, did the new non-traditional program listings did have an impact on the distribution between male and female? So one of the things that we did notice is that with the new SIPs that we received, there was some additional SIPs that sort of altered a little bit. Had we run them the traditional way we'd run them, we would have had a lower rate of non-traditional participation than what we got with the new list. But what we were doing is just following the guidance, because the rule there is, I believe, 25% has to, it centers around this 25% number, whether or not the particular program is at 25% of a specific gender. And that's sort of how they calculate whether or not it's a non-traditional for the gender. So,
Hey, Jay.
Yes.
I just wanted to address one of these questions because I think it's coming from confusion because I misspoke earlier, and I apologize for that. So we got a couple questions from folks about the performance data analysis table and being confused about the FY21 column because I said FY21 data. That's not correct. It's not necessarily FY21 data. You're just filling out that FY21 column. So if you remember, we had included that table in last year's application, but you obviously didn't have to do that table because we were just entering FY21 and obviously you didn't have that data. So that's just to show you, this is the column that you have to do, fill out the but you will utilize the most recent data that you have available to you within this data dashboard tool. I hope that clears it up a little bit. I apologize again for misspeaking earlier.
All right. Thanks, Tasha. Yeah, definitely a lot of nuance here, so appreciate all those questions. I think one other question coming in is around this issue of the updated SIP list, and we can provide that to IR folks. Maybe what we'll do is just making a note here. We're going to just move it over to the, actually, we don't have to move it over to your outgoing FTP. We can follow up as a part of this and just send out an email to our listservs, our respective listservs, of what those SIPs are. So we already have that, obviously, that list, and we'll send it out to both our IR listserv and the, I'm assuming, Tasha, you would probably want to share that with the Perkins listserv as well. But yeah, we'll follow up with that. Make sure you have the most recent one available to you. Now, keep in mind as we move from 3P1 into 2P1 and 1P1, some of those, when we look at non-trad rates, we'd be looking, because that's more of a longitudinal look. So some of those we're going to still be pulling in some SIPs that were under the old system. So, but we'll point that out when we move over. So so this takes us, let me see here. The data is not as current for 2P1 and 1P1, that is correct. And do you use the most current data available there? Yes, you'll do the same thing, the most current data that is available. And we are currently having some discussions about, you know, is there any way we can expedite the timeline on when we make data available? As I said earlier, you know, it's quite possible we could push out the 2P1 measure a little bit early because we don't have to wait those subsequent quarters to check for subsequent post-secondary enrollment or to check for employment. So, you know, we'll continue that conversation and maybe that'll be part of the feedback. But, you know, the most recent available that we have, because we're waiting for when wage records were available for 1P1, is, you know, it is farther back in time, but we'll continue that conversation. I don't want to get too sidetracked with it right now. So any other questions that I've missed, Brittany? I think I just looking here at the list, looks like I got most of them.
I think so, yes.
Okay. Actually, I do see just one that just popped up that I did miss here. Can we get this information at the program level? That would be very helpful for the program of study process. So that is a great question. One of the things that we've talked about, we've had a bit of this conversation previously, and for the IR folks who are on the call, they're very familiar with this. So one thing that we have done for many years is we provide colleges with what we call microdata files, or basically what it is when you guys, after we receive your submission and we go through our federal submission process, we give you back a file that outlines every student with certain data points about that student. We give that back to you and said, okay, you know, like maybe you're at McHenry and you had 900 students in a particular measure. Here's who those 900 students were. Here's all these various variables or things about them. What we want to do as sort of our very first step in this process, we're going to give you back 3P1. So if you're at College of DuPage, or let's do Elgin again, since we've been College of DuPage. So if you're at Elgin and in FY20, you had 1,273 students, we're going to give you back through your IR folks a Excel file that's going to have 1,273 students in it. Because remember, in 20, we're going to be looking at FY20 and we're going to be looking at FY21. So when you submit that data in for FY20 and we determine who's in the cohort, we can give that file back to you with all 1,273 students in it. And then you can actually not only know who they are, but you'd have a whole year to sort of do follow-up with them. Maybe they're even still at the college, right? Because we're looking at 2 years, we're looking at 20 and we're going to look at 21. But that will come back to you. So you're going to know who those individuals are. Our plan to do that would be probably in, at least for the 20 cohort, would be to start that in May, give you the FY20 cohort. And then when FY21 gets here, we're a little bit behind right now, but when FY21 is done, we can get that to you as soon as your A1s are final and we've completed our fall IPADS collection. But we can get that to you, and then you've got 9 months to follow with people who may still very well be at your college, if that makes sense. But our idea is to use that same methodology that we've done historically to give you back files and say, okay, here is who those individuals are, and here's who here's who we're going to be following up with over the next 2-year period to see how what their success look like and whether or not they obtained a job 2 quarters post-exit or whether or not they continue post-secondary. Now, that's the plan at this point, is to give you back the 3P1 file. I will tell you, I've already had some conversations with folks who are like, okay, that's great. We want to know who they are so we can, sort of take a look and see, any kind of things that we can do. But what about once everything's done? Do we get kind of a retro file back that shows everyone across time? So basically something that would show for 2P1, the folks who were completers, what happened to them in terms of employment or post-secondary enrollment. And that's a conversation I want to continue. We have some limitations on the 2P1. It's not a problem at all. Obviously, you guys already have that, and you know whether or not they completed. And many of your IR folks, we don't want to, part of why we do this is, as I said before, they have a lot on their plate, and if there's things that we can do to help facilitate the process and not put the work back on them, since we're the ones running the code, that we can give them something back that has this information outlined, and then you guys just have the data to do your analysis. That's very helpful. But so 2P1 isn't a problem because it's all completer. It derives from you. 1P1 becomes a little bit more of a problem. And the reason for that is when we match with IDS or the National Student Clearinghouse, even though these students are, technically yours, we have limitations within our data sharing agreements on how we can share that information at the individual student level. So it's a conversation worth continuing, and we definitely want to do that. But I do want to be completely transparent that we do have some limitations on what we can provide back when it comes to employment and subsequent post-secondary activity outside your institution. Okay. All right, so I don't see any other questions at this point. So let's go ahead then and move on to, so 3P1, most recent data available is what you gave us, FY20. And so that's what's available in the dashboard. We're going to go over and jump over to 2P1. So this information is all based on your completers. And the first thing you're going to notice here is that the most recent data we have here is 18. And probably the first thing you're going to think of is, well, that's really not very actionable. That's some time back. And you're correct, but again, keep in mind what we're looking for when we look at completers. Let me bring this back up again. I'm going to just as a visual here. So when we look at October 2020, when that data is available, we're taking the FY18, well, let me put it slightly a different way. I think it will make more sense. If you look at what we were talking about in terms of 3P1, the most recent data that we have available is FY20. Right? So that data will not show up in the dashboard until FY22. And the reason for that is we take 20 and 21. That's what we're matching to see whether or not they were completer. Then we have to wait 2 quarters plus the time it takes IDS to get their wage records to match to get the final results of that. Now, as I said, maybe there's something that we can do around 2P1 to make it a little bit more actionable, but 1P1, this will always be the case. It's just a simple matter of longitudinal data and when it's available. But that's why you're seeing currently in this dashboard just 17 and 18. Now, we do know the results of 19 because we have your completers from 18 and 19, but we don't yet know, for your 19 cohort, we'll have to, we're checking completions against 19 and 20, and the IDS data for that second quarter match isn't available until June of 2021. So, but this works exactly the same way. Oh, one other thing I wanted to point out and go back for just a second. If you've applied a filter and you're looking at your college, and this is where I had Elgin, right? And let's say you've been looking at 3P1, but you want to look at 2P1. If you come over to 2P1, it's going to keep the filter that you applied at the college level. Now, the other filters, we currently don't have it keeping those filters. That may be something we need to investigate, but at a minimum, if you're looking at your college and you want to look at 3P1, 2P1, 1P1, you don't have to keep adding the filter back in. It's always going to keep your filter on each measure until you either go up and remove it from the college name or clear out the filter. So, but again, this is 3P1. Let's jump over to 2P1. And here, exact same layout. The one thing that you'll notice is that we don't have, like we had on 3P1, we don't have foster care, homeless, and parent active duty. We don't have those fields searchable. And now the reason for that, of course, is remember we didn't start collecting those until fiscal year 19. So when we move into fiscal year 19, those items, those filters would then apply. But there's no, because right now, if they were up there, it would just be NA for everyone. So it really doesn't make sense to have those. But otherwise, that information is the same. Now, one thing I want to point out, I'm not going to go over all these because we've already talked about that, and you understand that just by pointing at any measure, it'll give you the numbers. If you want to isolate to a specific group, you can click on the legend. And anything that you filter is also going to show up here for the most recent year available. And this particular box here is doing the exact same thing that I took a few minutes to explain in 3P1. It's taking your program or the selected items, all selected items, comparing it against the state and all selected items, right? It's doing the exact same thing, but unlike 3P1, which is exclusive to non-traditional enrollment, this is exclusive to completions, okay? So, and again, we see much higher completion versus, pretty nice completion right now. So if you're wondering about your plan and what you would plug in, would be the most recent data available. So again, we'll go over and let's take a look at, let's try McHenry. So if I'm McHenry and I'm looking at, well, that's a little bit of an anomaly there. It did something I didn't like, but again, beta version, so we can expect some of this stuff. But the most recent data is 18. And for McHenry, the completion rate for that was 79.2. So that's what would go into your plan for the most recent year, because that's the most recent that we've published, that we've made publicly available. Real quickly, just a quick reminder, I don't think I pointed out this column, but I think it's helpful to keep in mind. Unless we make an adjustment, there's a column here that tells you the date that this is publicly available. And by that, I mean in the dashboard. Unless we make a change, which we can't really for 3P1 and we can't really for 1P1. 2P1 is the only one where we'd even have an option. But this will roughly give you that time of when a specific fiscal year's data becomes available in the dashboard. Just keep that as a reference. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this out. But again, this is showing you the most recent year that is available. And one other thing I wanted to point out, having done the Perkins training before, I know myself and my colleagues, we've often gotten questions about, okay, we saw this number in this measure, and then how are they tracked over time? Where do they kind of show up? So if you look here, and you can see the total students for fiscal year 18 was 40,096, right? If you go back to 3P1, and you're thinking about, you've got 20, 19, 18, 17, all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the data, right here's 18, right? You can see in 18 and 3P1, you had 40,096. So that tells you, and when 20 becomes available, you should see 36,893. It's a very logical progression. You come in, you meet the definition. Are you non-trad or not? Then we look at 2 years and see if you completed or not. And then after you complete, then we follow up to see if you were successful in obtaining employment or subsequent post-secondary activity. But these numbers that you see here, and this goes to what Sam was saying earlier, this denominator should always show up in its respective year for 2P1, because it's the same denominator. It's taking the same universe and just saying, hey, did these folks complete or not? Okay. So going back to 2P1. And so I see a question that just popped up. So at any time, if you want to know what was the overall completion rate for my program, so you would just go up and you would select your program, looking at College of DuPage here. So I can see the blue is always representative of the program and any item selected. Red is always a representation of the state and any item selected. So I can see here for College of DuPage in fiscal year 18, their completion rate was 77.3 versus the state's at 80.2. I can add other things in here, like I can say, all right, maybe let's look at health science, and there we go. So that means over the 2-year period of the folks that were in College of DuPage in FY18, the 1,519, over that 2-year period, here's the number of individuals who were awarded some type of certificate or degree. All right. So this is always showing you what your most recent information is. And again, you can see what the state rate was as well. One thing that we did add here, and on the other screen on 3P1, this is more of 3P1 is all about non-traditional enrollment. So we don't have charts, because every chart here, like that we see below, these are all charts that center on the completion rate of these subgroups, right? Whereas like with 3P1, it's not it's the non-traditional rate. So that's why here we're looking at College of DuPage still, remember, because it keeps the filter you've applied. So I can see non-traditional rate across all of these subgroups looks like this for this program. But then when I get to 2P1, again, it's going to keep my filter to the college, but it's going to show me what completion rates look like for these subgroups. And it's doing the same thing again for gender and for race ethnicity. Again, I can click on African American, filter to just that group, for example. And here I can see these red lines are being represented here. So for 18, 82.9% is where the state came in, and 80% is where the state came in 17. That's just a little rounding difference there. So let me go ahead and clear this off and stop here. And one thing that we should see, think again about the logical longitudinal progression, right? So if that's true, what we should see is this number should track to the 3P1 cohort, and then this number should track to 1P1's cohort, because we're taking those who are successful in obtaining a credential, award, a certificate, what have you, and then following up with them. So what we should see in the 18 numbers statewide would be 32,155, right? Because again, we're just following that natural progression to see what happens to this group over time. And I use the term cohort, but you know, for those of you familiar with iPads, it's not the cohort in the traditional sense of full-time, first-time, all that kind of stuff. For our cohort basis or purposes, what we're using is what we see here. This is really, if you met the criteria for being included in Perkins, if the answer to either of those two questions was yes, and you show up here, that's really kind of, when I say cohort, that's what I mean. I'm not talking about, you don't have to be a first-time student, you don't have to be full-time, you just have to meet one of these definitions. So that's really what we're talking about here. All right. Let me just check right quick and see what kind of questions we're getting in here. Let's see here. We've gotten several questions in on chat and on the Q&A. Yes, for both 2P1 and 1P1, you'll be using the most recent data, which would be 18 that's available. So in the second row of boxes, the darker blue labeled NA is state level, correct? So here's the thing, in the second row of boxes, I'm assuming that you're talking about these right here, right? So if you look here, the only reason that these would be state level is if I have no filter, right? The moment I apply a filter of any kind, say going back to College of DuPage, my line here, this dark blue line, it's still NA, and meaning that the individual was not reported as having a disability, or the individual wasn't reported as having a disadvantaged status, anything like that. It's just saying that for that particular measure, here's how it's a either or, either they're reported as disabled or not, either they're reported as economically disadvantaged or not, that kind of thing. Now, here's an interesting thing. Like if we look here, single parent, we see NA, right? So what is that telling us, right? Would be the question. That would tell us, and you can see this if you look at the underlying data, that for the students in question for the year, no students, all are NA because no students were reported as single parent. So, when you think about that and knowing College of DuPage, and probably your college, it doesn't really matter. What that is probably just a matter of collection. Are we able to get this information? Because we're pulling from the variable that you give us around single parent. This just means that that was not reported, something that we could pull from in that fiscal year. But if you were a college that did report that variable, what you would see is just like when I switched over to College of Lake County, now you see a variable for single parent and one where single parent wasn't indicated. Again, right click, show as a table, and you can see here, okay, for single parent, I had 524 students in 18, and of those, 440 or 83.9% were successful. And then I can come over and look, okay, of those who were not reported as single parents or NA, we had over 1,100 students, and 1,022 or 87.88% were successful in obtaining a credential or award. So that's what it's always, this line, the legend will always guide you. And the only place where really the issue of state becomes, state data is being displayed regardless of filter is this red lines and this little sort of tracker here. Sort of our vision, we're kind of thinking once we get into a point where we have a significant number of targets and we're in that year, we could even impose like here's the state target line, right, across this, and then here's how the state actually performed, and then show your information. So that way you've got kind of 3 reference points all in the same chart. But I don't want to get the old proverbial wagon too far in front of the horse there, as the saying goes, right? So see a question, if I wanted to dig deeper, do I need the A1 microdata report, or can I find some of this information in the data books on ICCB's website? So what you would find on ICCB's website would be information related to CTE enrollment, but that does not necessarily mean the individual would be in this cohort, because keep in mind, that's just the data book, for example, is just based on what the student's declared major is. It doesn't look at anything else. It doesn't look at what programs they completed or how many hours they had. So I think to answer this question, Aubrey, directly, I think the thing that would be most helpful for you is those microdata files and working with your IR folks, or and maybe, I'm not sure, maybe you're in IR, but anyway, I think, getting the microdata files back so that you can kind of do that additional analysis, and of the, X number of CTE students you had, here's what the Perkins cohort looked like. But there isn't a table in the data book per se that would have that information. But I think, as just knowing the people I have talked with that are both in Perkins and in IR, I really expect to get some, and I've already received some suggestions that I think will help refine this tool to make it helpful in doing some of that analysis as well. Now, there's some analysis that will always, of course, occur outside the dashboard, but you're not able to pull any kind of microdata file or student level files from this dashboard. So, and the final question, if you think you've found mistakes or something that doesn't seem right, certainly you can feel free to email Tasha, or if you want to CC us, I'm sure Tasha would be fine with that. But just typically, Tasha, is there anything you'd like to say about how you would like for that to be dealt with?
No, yeah, you can forward any questions you have to me, and then if I can answer it, I will answer it, and if not, I will send it either to Jay and or Sam. So that might just be the cleanest way to do that. Okay,
perfect. Okay, let's see here. Just looking here, looks like maybe there's a typo. We'll take a look at that one. Just trying to make my way through the questions here. There's quite a few that sort of popped in here. Let's see. Yeah, one comment that come in, I think, is maybe to touch on, is some of these rates will look, sometimes as we've been experimenting, you'll see things pop up with 80% or 100%, right? And usually when you get to looking, it's like, oh, well, that was 2 students or something like that, right? So yeah, context does provide, knowing that does provide additional level of context. Let's see here.
So Jay and Tasha, we did have one question come in, and I apologize for my dog barking in the background. Since the document for SDLP will be completed in this dashboard, will we need to download from here and complete an Amplifund, or will it automatically upload?
So nothing is going to upload from Amplifund directly from this Power BI site. No. So you would either have to download it and then attach it with your performance data information within Amplifund. And honestly, I'm still also learning the nuances of Amplifund. So for some reason that's not attaching, you can just send it to the ICCB CTE listserv or your Perkins liaison. Okay, so if something's not working right, just send it to us.
Yeah, and the amount of information, Tasha, please correct me if I'm wrong here. I just want to make sure I understand in case we get questions. But the amount of information that you're asking for in terms of them submitting about the performance is pretty limited as far as what they have to submit as a part of their plan, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So you really just need to like the surface level information on that performance data analysis table. And then sort of like the number 2 question under the performance data, like sort of like the narrative portion, that can just be a document. And then whatever supplemental information you want to send to us that correlates with your performance improvement plan, you know, essentially like, okay, so we're deficient in 1P1. This is why. These are the subgroups or special populations that are negatively affecting that. And that's why we're writing this specific activity meant to try to help those populations achieve greater. So yes, so does that make sense, Jay?
It does, yes.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification. So yeah, that's great. You know, one thing I always find myself asking, you know, when we do things like this, or when I have, you know, gotten a new tool or something like that, is in the end, like, okay, yeah, it tells me something, but how are some ways that I can use that? One thing I want to speak to before I move to the final slide here is just really to get to what Tasha was just saying there. So, you know, if I'm College of Lake County and I'm looking at my 2P1 measure, you know, part of what we're trying to design is instead of you having to go in and out of spreadsheets, I'm just going to focus on 2P1, right? This way I get my big picture, but this allows me to come down here and without me having to go in and out of spreadsheets, think about this. Like I want to know, okay, so here's what I was at, 83.8% in 17. I'm at 86% in 18, the most recent year that's available. So like what I then might want to do is say, okay, where in the subgroups am I performing below that? So then I could kind of come down and see, and this gets to that whole idea of intervention. So like I can see here in 18, I can see what those who weren't reported as English language learners look like for completion, or those who were. I can also see maybe my strategy might be around, you know, trying to engage through an equity lens, maybe Hispanic students or maybe African American students. And so I can come up here, I can look and see that, okay, so for African Americans, I can kind of go and see how they performed compared to other groups. So maybe, you know, I want to have some additional outreach. And a lot of this, in terms of that exploration, our hope is that by being able to just visibly or just sort of hovering over the data or the data points that are of concern to you, you can quickly see, okay, wait a minute, yeah, that's at 50%, but that's only because it's just 4 students, right? So maybe my intervention is not going to be specifically designed for that group, or even like down here, English language learners, maybe it's 50%. Again, okay, it's just 4 students. So by just doing that hover, that takes a lot of the sort of the manual cleanup and lifting of the spreadsheets and going through spreadsheets. This allows you to sort of get that high level. If you think of, I always refer to as like the bird's eye view of here's what's going on in this measure. I can look down and see it. And then maybe I want to drill in and say, okay, is that true of, you know, whatever, maybe, you know, your program has a lot of individuals in one specific cluster. Maybe you want to drill into that cluster, right? So just, you know, a few things to consider and throw out. And, you know, again, I can't plug enough. If you are using this and you go, well, you know, it'd be really nice if this dashboard would pivot around this particular item, or maybe there was a tab or something that was specific to a career cluster or something like that. If you come across that and you see that, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know so we can kind of think about how could we restructure this. So you still got that bird's eye view, the 20,000 foot view, right? But you've also got an ability to more granularly dig down and inspect that particular program. So let's see here. One thing I want to go back to, and then final thing before we moved over to the last item is question, since you're using a cohort system, if the student is not in the original cohort in that year, but the student changes their academic program after that, they won't be included in that cohort, so their completion may not count. So it may not count for that year. But again, remember, we're looking at these Perkins 5 3P1. We look at these based on the year, right? So it's possible that maybe they didn't make the cut for the definition in the 3P1 here in maybe 20, but maybe they didn't have, they only had 9 hours maybe, and they didn't have a CTE completion, but maybe in the next year they did that. Maybe they had either some kind of a CTE completion in 12 hours. because we're looking at 3P1 in that year and saying, in this year, here's what 3P1 looks like. Here's how many students met the definition, and of those, here's how many were in a non-traditional program. Okay. All right, so moving over, and again, we're going to move over to the last slide, and that is 1P1, doing the exact same thing here. And you'll notice, again, filters kept. Let's go back and check something. I used the example earlier. It should be 32155. And hopefully this looks right. Let's make it sure here. So we had 1,462 completers in FY18 from College of Lake County. If I'm College of Lake County and I go look at 1P1, 1462, that's exactly what I should expect, because I should always see this number tracking over, because all that's saying is of those 1,600 plus students that completed, here's how many I'm going to look at 2 quarters post-exit to see if they were successful in obtaining employment or subsequent post-secondary activity. So right there, we know we're good. And if I were to remove the filter and look at the state, remember, that should be 32155, right? And that's exactly what it tracks to. That's very, very longitudinal that we're looking at here. Everything else is the same here. You've got all of your same kind of measures that you saw on 2P1. And again, we don't show foster care those because this is 17 and 18, and it's not yet, those items weren't yet being collected. Everything else works the same way, including this. We've got the placement rate with the for the selected items, including program and all other selected items. And then we've got a state rate with all items that have been selected except program. So, you know, if I'm looking at a specific program and I start adding in clusters, maybe I look at health science. So I'm starting to see here for College of DuPage, individuals who are in a health science cluster, I'm seeing the rates here. So I can see the program's placement rate versus the statewide placement rate for that group of individuals in health science. If I come down, and remember, I'm recommending to you that you use your legend to filter instead of clicking on an individual box. But if I want to add African American into that mix, and maybe I want to add female, you can see it's filtering down to just those 2 groups. So then I can see, okay, so for African American females at my program versus state, here's how things look. So we know there's a few places where there's some things that are, you know, just like here, where, you know, it just sort of shows us a subset of that group, and there's some things that we'll do a little bit of cleanup on, but we didn't want to wait any longer and wait on perfection, so we wanted to release the beta version so you guys can start using it, we can start getting feedback, and we can start refining. But our hope is that you will find this useful and helpful, and as I said, in early May, somewhere around that time, we'll be releasing some of the microdata files around 3P1. But with that, I want to stop and see if there's any questions, whether you want to, any other questions, anything else coming in, Brittany, that we need to address. And certainly I want to open it up to anyone for that might have questions. Anything that was unclear, we have 16 minutes left. I'm definitely not going to go over on a Friday afternoon on a data session. So, but if there's any specific questions you have, I'd be happy to address those.
Yeah, and you can feel free to, if you have a working microphone, you can use the raise hands feature, and I would be more than happy to unmute you as well.
All right, well, we're waiting for questions to come in. Tasha, Sam, is there anything else that you guys feel like we need to include today that I've left off?
No, I don't think so, Jay. I really just wanted to finish up saying we will be sending out the PowerPoint presentation as well as the link to this recording within probably, I was going to say the next few days, but it's Friday. So probably Monday or Tuesday. And then I did want to note that in the resources section in the presentation, I included the link to that flowchart that Jay was referencing earlier. And then I also included the link to the data dashboard, as well as the username and login password information. So.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. We do have one question in the QA.
Okay.
And looks like chat as well.
All right. Yeah, so Tasha, sounds like this question may be for you. Similarly to in the past, do we only write PIPs in the PDA for the indicators that are below the state determined level of performance? And is there a required number of PIPs?
Yes, so you're only writing performance improvement activities in your performance improvement plan if your actual level of performance, or ALP, is below the SDLP, or the state determined level of performance. Yes, there is not a required number of PIPs, other than you're required to write one activity for each of your deficient measures. So if you are deficient in 1P1, 2P1, and 3P1, you're required to write one activity for each of those. There's not a maximum number, but just make sure that your activities are targeted and specific. So does it make sense to have 15 activities for 1P1? Probably not. You really want to make sure that you're writing activities that you're going to see move that measure. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you, Tasha. All right. Not seeing any other questions. In closing, I would say expect from us and Perkins folks, please work with your IR staff on this, but expect from us a 3P1 microdata file to reflect the students that were in your FY21 3P1 file. Also, we would be providing you with the updated SIPs list as well, so that you have that for reference. And in two final quick comments. The survey would be toward the end, probably after your plans are due. So please don't hesitate, which takes me into my final point. Don't hesitate to reach out as you're working on your PIPs and reviewing this right now while it's fresh in your head. If, don't hesitate to reach out to us and just say, hey, we'd like for it to do this or that, or, this isn't, this would be helpful. This is the time to do that while it's fresh in your heads and you're using it. That's when you're going to have your best ideas. And we're excited to move beyond the beta release and really get it refined up. So, and just to really also say, appreciate everyone joining on a Friday afternoon for a data session. That's always, it's usually more of a Tuesday morning activity instead of Friday. So really appreciate everyone's joining in today.
Yes, I agree. And we did have one more question that I wanted to address, Jay. The question is, if you are not below on any of the three areas, so 1P1, 2P1, or 3P1, do you still have to do a performance improvement plan? No, if you're not deficient in any of the three performance measures, you do not have to do a performance improvement plan. However, you still need to do your due diligence and you need to answer those questions under number 2, under the performance data analysis, those more narrative type questions. And I really suggest that you still dive into your data, because just because you might be meeting the SDLP doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement, okay? That just means you're not required to do a performance improvement plan.
All right, so seeing no further questions, I'm going to go ahead and conclude and give everyone back a full 11 minutes. So use them wisely, I guess, right? Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all so much.
Again, thank you for showing up and attending this presentation.